21st century's colorblindness. Many explain racialized carceral expansion as conservative backlash as a theory. Conservative backlash encourages certain analytical practices of finding racial power with eyes fixed on the signs of conservative law and order. Liberal agendas become glossed quickly and presumed virtuous accounts of conservative backlash, inclusive specificity of racial liberalism, polarizing conservative versus liberal, risk depoliticizing racial power and naturalizing some non-racial background. It's conservative racialization with traumatized searching for racism as subtextual coding means missing liberal criminal racialization that thrived in the full light of day. Racial power is not something direct or intentional, it's rather a system of property permeating, circulated throughout its constituted society. Liberal forms mobilized through a white pity or paternalism. Oppression was wrong because it damaged personalities and changes had to be made to protect the African Americans. Liberals commissioned the historic tendency of opposing blacks as object of pity, considered brown feet poor brown, reinforced paternal notions of black benefit from proximity to white superiors. Liberals criminalized the race problem. Black laws for liberals and expression of aggression. Kennedy urged passage of civil rights legislation because the fires of frustration are burning in every seat of Johnson's commission articulated this quintessential philosophy of civil rights laws, the law against crime. The double edge of liberal advocacy becomes clear. Civil rights legislation militated against recognition of black humanity that conjured the black criminal, the vigor used to justify lynching, chain gangs, exploitative labor segregation, the overall maintenance of white supremacy. This has informed the way that modern carceral reform has been justified. Crime policy reforms on the basis of fairness and justice modernize the carceral machinery that exacerbates racial inequality. We need to question rather the ideology of incarceration. Mercado 14, when seen on a timeline of fiscal conservatism, carceral expansion is puzzling. Crime policy is frequently presented as an outlier in the conventional wisdom of racial parties and liberal law and orders recognize that the centerpiece. Carceral expansion is neither puzzling nor exceptional. It is a tragically commonplace story of freedom struggle, threaten state legitimacy by exposing state-sanctioned white violence. Liberal lawmakers secured legitimacy through reforms that tame lawless racial violence. Lawmakers justify carceral reform into the carceral state, usually with the result of exacerbating racial. The liberal system secured the integrity of brutal, even lethal state violence and enabled war policing. The strategic ambiguities policy made it difficult to distinguish policy from racial fairness for policy. There's a distinction without a difference. Liberal law and order refined the carceral state and administrative fixes made violence not pure, less emotional, and more rights. The race neutral laws would mean the racially disparate outcomes would be seen if at all as individually particularized and not racially motivated. Expunged from institution to abstract of the material world, race and its gamut. The liberal law and order was especially powerful in entrenching black criminality. Liberal lawmakers selectively accommodated activist demands in ways that inverted original visions of justice. Brown factored out racial harm manifested material condition. Ordinary talk equated civil rights and labor rights. The civil rights victory of Brown actually restricted the meaning of racial justice. The answer to Jim Crow became the colorblind constitution. Now this is the predominant mode of racist
I meant to take that card out. You can take that.
Not reading the card. We advocate an end to the criminalization of marijuana as a tactic in a broader decarcerative strategy. Prison abolitionism requires incremental work towards alternatives to the prison industrial complex. Marijuana reform is critical. Davis 3 and abolition institutions. We would not be looking at decarceration strategy rather than a single alternative to the existence. We might envision our in this context, it makes sense to consider the decriminalization of drug use as a significant component of a larger strategy to simultaneously oppose structures of racism with the criminal justice system and further the abolitionist agenda of decarceration. The campaign to decriminalize drug use for marijuana led countries such as the Netherlands to revise their laws legalizing personal use of drugs such as marijuana and hashish. Decriminalization will advance the abolitionist strategy of decarceration, that is, the consistent reduction in the number of people who are sent to prison with the ultimate aim of dismantling the prison system as the dominant mode of punishment. Now, our radical critique in favor of drug law reform is a key site to establish a decarcerative strategy resulting in policy changes that challenge the legitimacy of the carceral regime and lead to prison abolition. Such a reform strategy of greater concern is the tendency of prison regimes to co-opt reform vulnerabilities led call for non-reformist reforms that do not lead to bigger and better prisons. Building bridges and important steps toward challenge the racialized dehumanization undergirds incarceration, an important component of a radical anti-prison agenda. Activists challenge stereotypical images of the criminal, demonstrated the inadequacy of incarceration. Decarceration involves targeting specific prison populations to the public sees the low risk. Reform is key. Campaigns to promote drug law reform by racial justice, fair intersection of racialized state violence lays the groundwork for a broader abolitionist agenda. Activists who are the public's reliance on the idea of imprisonment, activist youth and student organizers and mobilize public service to provincial government. The campaigns multi grassroots, multiracial, anti-prison youth movement to raise public awareness. Activist youth campaigns for decarceration is building less towards abolition, are essential to long-term transformation. Abolition means to towards our dreams and lead. If things really can be different, it means live in this vision of conscious of believe a world without prison as possible. It requires practical steps towards the long-term goal and action and goals that holds to maintain the advantages of both. Towards abolition, Burger 13, decarceration by radical critique, direct action, abolitional strategy that works to shrink the prison system through the accommodation of pragmatic demands of far-reaching open critique is reform in pursuit of abolition. Decarceration allows a strategic launch pad. Abolition providing an abstract framework for the course of action rather than juxtapose pragmatism or radicalism. Decarceration seeks to hold them in creative tension. It is in the best tradition of the Black freedom struggle. It seeks to take advantage of political conditions without sacrificing political vision. Movements against them will bring together diverse communities. The fight against prison is both targeted campaign and a broad-based struggle. The challenge to maintain the aspirational elements while translated into political program. Decarceration works to shrink the prison system. Even as many states have shrunk their prison population, they have done left in place the deepest markings of the carceral state. Certain movements need to confront the underlying ideologies that hold there's an acceptable level of widespread imprisonment. There is a risk that that the current reform impulse will be bifurcated along notions of deservingness that will continue to uphold the carceral logic that separates good people from bad people. This needs to make new questions of accountability. The difference between life and death, state repression, expands solidarity's lifeline against a lot of people raise each other's conscience that fight in this pragmatic but militant radical treatment the carceral state out of existence for decarceration and decriminal reform. Administrative carceral justice. This is key to push normative debates to their core and challenging demands for reform of modest and scope and normatively outside the parts of the carceral state which the confidence of the police given general outside of the carceral state is no surprise that reform flourish benefits historically and proposals for better administration will likely reproduce the same arts of the problem and law and order regimes are clear. The liberal law less it is placed normative questions. Carceral machinery was not easily collected by small administrative adjustments and tight discretion to one place. The criminal justice system accommodates administrative tinkering, does not confront the damning features of the American carceral state. Its race constitution with reinforced and raised African American vulnerability, premature death by focusing on intra-system problems. Lawmakers this place question is just on a more manageable, measurable issues of system budget solutions, force questions for mediation on sanitary administrative down. Should a judge be elected or appoint mandatory minimums? These questions cannot replace clear commitments to racial justice when posed independently of normative goals. Process becomes the proxy, not the path to justice. Without a normatively grounded understanding of racial violence, liberal reforms will do the administrative trouble. Unlike administrative tinkering, reforms for decriminalization and decarceration push debates to their normative core. What warrants punishment, in what form, and why? In place of liberal searches for the ideal procedural path, measures of racial justice focus on the state sexual production of premature death. Now, the role of scholars and those who produce knowledge isn't to be political, but to be politically enabling. We don't believe we're exercising political action through the 1AC, but supplying rhetorical tools for understanding the prison system. This is the most productive role of the debate community. Welsh 12 Habermas's works can distinguish between the academic engagement and direct political action. Habermas aims to address the disconnection between scholarly reflection and practical political consequences. It does not mean the effective political agency of scholars. He seeks the democratic agency of citizens having effects on public discourse, not the same thing as the blind conceptual research for citizens engaged in democratic quality truth, which are to have consequences require consensus for the only attain such consequences need to be understood and adapted by citizens for doing their own and reducing the potential consequences of scholarship to political ones, risking return to expert manipulation and control, position of emancipation is something citizens can achieve for themselves. The role of scholars to provide conceptual resources that citizens might appropriate in their own ways is the very steps of the antagonism between scholarship and politics that allows the products of expert intuitive to be consequential. The rhetoricians and their insistence on media political performance neglect the rhetorical traditions guiding pedagogical service, supporting the political agency of citizens, aiming to white-minded citizens for scientific knowledge to have practical consequences with the need to achieve a higher stage of election. Mills guards scholarly reflection of the activity, irreducible political participation rather than embedded within a particular political partisan circle. Mills seeks to rescue social science from connection to political agendas. The role of reason neither means or requires the one hit the pavement, take the next plane to the scene of the current crisis, run for Congress, buy a newspaper, go among the poor, set up a soapbox. Actions are admirable for the social science that take up its normal activities is merely to advocate his role and to display by his actions a disbelief in the promise of social science and the role of reason. Scholars being citizens is not what he is talking about. Mills describes citizens being scholars or politically embedded citizens. Politically embedded citizens.
Why advocate the end of criminalization of marijuana here?
I guess if you're asking about the Welsh card that I just read, it says that the production of scholarship in academic spaces is valuable.
Production of scholarship in academic spaces. What scholarship have you produced?
We think that the 1AC's reading of the decarcerative movements described.
So the 1AC's reading of the Murakami book constitutes academic production in your interpretation.
Our claim
it's
is
not just rereading the book. It's drawing the connections between the resolution and the issues of civil rights.
So academic work, as you interpret it, is radical because you can read the Murakami book and say this is also about marijuana.
It is not that the 1AC's reading is a radical political act. Rather, it is an invitation to develop the conceptual resources.
Okay,
that
how do we
provide the
develop
basis
good conceptual resources inside of debate specifically?
Through debating about them. The evidence,
so?
the Welsh evidence says
Why does that create good strategies?
The Welsh evidence says that for truths to be politically consequential, they must arise out of a prudent consensus making. Why? Because
why?
If they have the backing and conceptual support of scholars that have lent them both the depth and nuance of the ideas, they become more politically
What is
valuable.
the broader decarcerative strategy that you're involved in?
I don't think that question asks.
You say we advocate an end to the criminalization of marijuana as a tactic in a broader decarcerative strategy. I'm asking what is the broader decarcerative strategy?
Well, the point is that marijuana is a the ending of criminalization of marijuana is a tactic that can be adopted by people in decarcerative strategies.
Who is not adopting this tactic that will adopt it because you win this debate?
The point isn't that people directly adopt it. It's that we need to have debates and dialogues over potential tactics.
Who listens to these debates and then adopts the tactic that you've offered that they've probably already adopted?
The idea that debate is entirely insulated from everything else in the world doesn't really make
I don't
any
think
sense.
that's true. I'm asking
Our
a
argument
basic...
is don't force it down the throat that anyone has to adopt it.
Well,
It's rather that create the possibilities of doing so.
What possibilities do you create?
Who, when participating in debate, has the ability to appropriate the resources and conceptual frameworks we create.
What's the difference? Okay, so the Sudbury card says that activists are faced with limitations in their reformist strategies. They need to call for non-reformist reforms. Then the Welsh card says, oh, we're not actually activists, we're just scholars. So what's the difference between a scholar and activist? Distinctions you draw pretty clearly.
Sure. The Welsh evidence indicates that the difference between the scholar and the activist is one that is itself politically disenabling. So I would reject that.
It distinctly draws that. It says scholars should not be the ones who are on the streets, because that gives up on the idea of social science.
The argument that scholars have no relationship to activism is problematic. I would say that activists are the people like Julia Sudbury and Angela Davis. Scholars are people like Welsh. Citizens are everybody like...
We're... Connected to the out of the round.
My Gmail is telling me you sent me a virus.
To a dead object, and we can construct a sentimental economy of pleasure and pacification, their fantasy of change to investment in the law shields criticism and guises violence. Berlin, in 99 Robert's bodies situated in the global marketplace, signifying a race that will be won by nations who condition are most optimal. The media presses new scandals at home and abroad, which can be a good thing, yet even as the image of the traumatized proliferators competes with the normative utopian image of U.S. citizens, which remain unmarked. Exploitation only appears as a scandal, and a scandal snuggled in the scheme of memory. Mourning is a beautiful experience of emancipation, takes over the place over distance. Even the object is neither dead nor at any great distance. Bound to be an act of aggressive social death, making songs of scandals. The exploitation elsewhere. Morning play the backward of the military march of capitalist triumphalism can be heard survival. The survival can only be a state of energy and intimacy. It's the pressure of feeling a shock. Legal producer required for double therapy, victim in the viewer, national sentimentality promotes and maintains a Germany of national identity, forms that sentimentality is longer the means by which mass subaltern advantage advances the true core of national collectivity, theoretically identification with pain leads to change out, yet the this very source of protection protection have much of traditional matrices of cultural hierarchy, the imagined capacity of the institutions to assimilate the affective tactics of subaltern counterpolitics, weakness, the sharp specificity of traumatic models of pain, curious characterize what a person is what a person becomes a social engaging counter his body, the elements of pain actually sustain the utopian image of homogeneous, homogeneous natural metaculture which can look like a healed body. The tactical use of trauma over-identifies the eradication of pain with the achievement of justice, and mental politics makes these confusions credible, and this violence is variable as the cultural power confirms the centrality of interpersonal identification and empathy with the vitality of collective life. This is part and parcel of a process that culminates in human extinction. In ancient circles, who closer to things which is ethically forbidden gives us anguish of the heaviest kind, so we generally don't. The death drive is the most direct satisfaction of the drive, but it's also unconsciously masticating. We refuse to even acknowledge our times. It willfully ignorant drive for death for the entire species, ecological death, proliferation of nuclear weapons, and myths, vital research for energy and democracy. We have armed things to the teeth with no sovereign good. We think that the answer has to be more moral. However, the idea of the good predicates itself the radically false picture of the human condition. The dusting when it returns after being denied is even more devastating. We are accelerating along a race toward destruction, and nihilism has never threatened such a grand finale. We still think of being more moral as the answer to, rather than the source of our problems. The death drive wills to go beyond the destruction. The principle which free sense can emerge. We can say yes to life the way that it overcomes nihilism by only saying by only freeing ourselves from the races, neuroses. We must continually train ourselves to stare the real directly in the face. Chances are we're going to be happy enough. Not even a genuine pop political praxis. We either face up to the death drive or let the drive research until it finishes. A failure to think enjoyment in relation to politics causes phantasmic repression, which always results in eruptions and returns of death. McGowan in 13. What could a thinking person not want to side with life rather than death? In interpreting terrorist attacks, ultimately life affirming response to idealism. They reject being in love with. I can't explain why so many suicide bombers are middle class. We must imagine that there is a to death itself. Death is a source of value. Without value, death provides neither love nor ice cream nor friendship nor anything we particularly enjoy would be much worth much would have any special worth whatsoever. Infinite time we would be unable to enjoy what makes life worth living by depriving us of an authentic relationship to death and ideology. Precludes life as the only value. It creates a valueless world where nothing matters. Privileged life will seem to leave the value creating power intact, but this is not what happens. We change the way we experience the world. The capitalist economy suffocates too much life. Further the project of modernity moves in the direction of life more forcefully. The spectre of fundamentalism will make its presence felt. Exclusive focus on life produces an eruption of death explosion. Fundamentalist violence represent the return of modernity. Symbolic structure cannot accommodate violence as blowback, not simply a response to feelings. Aggressive debate is structured by an agential fantasy. The plan is an impotent academic offering that is answered and alleviated by judges only to restart the cycle next round. The AF and WTO protesters share a common refusal to surpass politics as demand for politics of direct claim. The alternative is not a new mode of politics, but a no to the affirmative. Only this intervention breaks apart the fantasy and allows us to crack open the coordinates of desire that open the AF up to a mode of political subjectivity that can name and claim what it wants without calling on an inaccessible symbolic other. Lumberg in 12 o'clock provides a way of thinking of the political as a space of demand and politics working the practice and specific demands. Demand represents a hegemonic order creating a implicit picture of how it functions and how it might change. Framing enjoyment as equivalent to hegemonic law identifies the fundamental split in the psychoanalytic theory between universal particular demands, but between one who's entered an equivalential relationship with the identitarian claim that suitors is subject to a set of linkages. The demand is to be recognized as subject and given the sanction of the symbolic order. The perverse dialectic of misfires reveals something politically dangerous about not moving past the demand. Not all equivalences are equally equivalent. The generative power of the demand relies on the fact that some demands will be refused. Ego is nothing more than a recognition and refusal of demands. Signifiers are constituted by their difference. The subjects come into being and negotiating their entry. The rather demand is less a way of addressing the call than a call for recognition from the other. The other cannot ever give this transform to the realm of political demands. This framing and reverses the classically liberal presupposition regarding demand and agency. There's a presupposition that demand is a way of exerting agency more firmly. The demand is lodged the greater. The agential effect of Lacanian sees exactly the opposite. The more firmly one lodges demand, the more desperately one clings to the legitimate ability of the institution to fulfill. Demands ought to reach a kind of breaking point where the inability of an institution to proper response to produce a re-evaluation of the economy and demand is by this moment of subtraction where the manifest content is stripped away and the desire that underwrites it led there. The point is to bring the subject to the point where they might recognize and name their own desire, become a political subject, and being able to truly argue for something without being dependent on the other as an organizing principle for political identity. Naming it's about political subjectification, not solely oriented toward the locus of demand. This word subject becomes a new political possibility alternative. Police subjects can say fixate on the demand, forfeit the possibility of desire, and allows this to not go far enough to constitute the subject. Desire leaves demonstrated. The hysteric is defined by incessant demand, the expressive articulated desire, which is theirs. The hysteric demand of the other producing object, which is supported the aversion of one's own desire. What appears as unfettered agency is surrender of desire by enjoying the active figuring the other is one with the exclusive capability to satisfy the demand of the register of manifest content. Demands a claim for action, a seemingly powerful the level rhetorical form. Demand is a kind of surrender. The limitation of the student's call does not lie in the end that they saw, but the fact that the hysterical dress night never quite breaks free from the framing of the master. The fundamental problem of democracy is addiction to mastery and a deferral of desire. Hysteria is net politically constraining because the form of demand is a way of organizing enjoyment relies that the system continues to act in certain ways to sustain its logic case. There's no meaningful relationship between their education and agency claims that social change get out of the argument room. Schlag and 3, the presumption is that the word of the judge will produce a social reality that corresponds with the word of the other. The endlessly repeated question, what should the court do? Leads law students believe that the court responds to their argument when the academic loses faith in the law. Typically the person is most troubled because he has lost a framework which makes her academic project possible. Isn't the demand that the law conform to the academic project a selfish one? Intellectual belief that the law offers an interesting vocabulary, grammar, and rhetoric through which to think about the world and law itself. This is naive. The argument room is a place where academic advocates go to argue passionately about the law and politics. Within the room, arguments are won and lost. No one outside the room pays much attention to what goes on inside the room. Sometimes there's a seat which participants spend time arguing about what should happen outside the room. This they call knowledge or politics. The one thing that generally cannot be talked about inside the room is the construction of the room itself. The concept of politics does a great deal of work. It remains immune from scrutiny. Very often, to argue for political position is not political at all. It simply triggers a scholastic meta-discourse about what arguments advance or sound should be adopted. In the university scholarly attention depends on the production of new exciting ideas as opposed to the problem for the left. The victims remain the same. This leads to deja vu. It seems that someone should feel authorized to say you should do X. The belief is the failure. The belief is the future of liberation hangs on the laws of Got antagonists, deploying machines against each other. Legal thought is the deployment of a series of rhetorical operations over and over. At this point, it's time to move on. The proliferation of meaning and consciousness raising relies on a fantasy of communication which implodes under its own weight. More knowledge does not change reality. Better rhetorical or communicative tools do not lead to social justice. Baudrillard 2K, despite efforts to reinject message meanings of our past, the loss of meanings directly linked to the dissolving action of information. Information is thought to create communication. We are complicit in the midst is the alpha and omega of our modernity, without which the credibility of our social organization will collapse. Well, it is collapsing because when we think information produces meaning, the opposite occurs. Information devours its own content, devours communication. The social blackmail. If you speak to you are concerned, you are the event. A circular arrangement within which one stages the desire of the audience and never end people are recycling faith. Is information attached itself to the tautological proof. The political between only the practice of emancipation and constitution of political subject are seen as valuable. This is true. We know the superior impact of all object practice, the renunciation of the subject position and meaning to a system whose argument is oppression, the strategic resistance and the liberating claim of subjecthood. But this strategy is more reflective of an earlier phase of the system. Is no longer the strategic terrain. The current argument of the system is to maximize speech. This thus the strategic resistance and the refusal, meaning all the movements that play on conscious range do not see they are going in the direction of the system. Legalizing marijuana is the chocolate laxative. The call conceals the basic contradictions of liberalism's violence, which justifies system of domination as a means of protecting life. Zizek and 3 on today's market, we find a whole series of products deprived of their malignant property. Coffee without caffeine, politics without politics, up to today's liberal multiculturalism is an experience of other deprived of otherness, reality deprived of its substance. Everything is permitted. You can enjoy everything, but deprived of the substance that makes it dangerous. It is no longer the old notion of a right to measure pleasure and constraint, but media coincidence. The opposite. The fight against these changes is one of the main investments in today's biopolitics. The ultimate goal would be to invent opium without opium. opium. No wonder marijuana is so popular among liberals who want to legalize it. Already is a kind of opium. Without opium, the structure can be discerned through today's ideological landscape. There are two demands which determine today's liberal tolerant attitude: the respect for otherness and the obsessive fear of harassment. The same goes for war, pacifist militarism. It does not the same hold for more and more for even for democracy. If it is okay to be rethought, if it is cleansed of its populist excess, is what if these two stances nonetheless rely on the same root. What the two poles share is precisely is the notion that the ultimate goal of life is life itself. The notion of morally, legally responsible subjects is an ideological fiction whose function is to cover up the network of power relations. The obverse of the thesis that those who control the circumstances control the people. It is impossible not to hear beneath the unconditional injunction, you should enjoy a long and healthy life. What this means is the discourse of the university is thoroughly mystifying, concealing its true foundation, obfuscating the unfreedom on which it relies.
Okay, let's talk about the first Cardone case. The Schlag evidence
Yeah.
indicates that the primary rule of the argument room is that you cannot talk about the construction of the room itself. Why is
It's not the primary rule, that is an interesting facet of the room.
Okay, why is the reading of the Welsh card at the end of the 1AC not an identification of the room and its constraints and
It's an
possibilities?
identification with the room, maybe. I don't think it's an
We think
identification.
the Welsh card says that academics should continue to do academic things because by doing academic things, they provide useful academic tools to people who aren't academics. The
Yeah.
Schlag card goes to the second level of that and says that that is the fantasy of the legal academy, that what it is doing is endlessly providing tools that will then circulate outwards and provide tools to all the helpful people. The point is that doesn't really happen, and we get caught up in
Okay,
staying
so
inside of the
does-
room,
does
producing
Schlag-
more tools that don't
does
actually go
Sch-
anywhere.
What does Schlag think the role of legal scholars should be?
To
what
get
do
out of
you
the
think?
argument room.
To
And
provide.
go where?
I don't know.
There's nowhere else to.
Schlag says that it's useful to
If we
provide
construct
enigmatic.
the room, there's
and-
clearly something outside of it. Where do you want us to go, and what do you want us to
He
do?
says it's useful. We can't tell you what to do. That's sort of the first K. But more importantly, we think that it's important that we provide enigmatic descriptions of the status quo rather than providing sort of what we believe are clear conceptual tools that will be picked up by individuals and then deployed in sort of activist struggles.
Who picks up those enigmatic descriptions? Are
That's
they
the point.
politically
Yeah.
valuable?
Once again, you're like, who takes it up?
Are-
Who takes it
are-
up? It relies.
would
The
you-
efficacy
okay,
of your politics
fine.
relies on an other that can figure
What's
the
the
demand in a
connection
way that has a
between-
good
what's the
relationship with the
connection
institution. Our
between
point is
this-
we have to
what's-
get rid of that relationship. And
What's
that's
the connection between the Berlant evidence and any of the death drive stuff?
The Berlant evidence is about the sort of notion of liberalism as a sort of traumatic body that can be healed through greater practices of legal identification and communicative action. Our argument is that that is, first of all, not possible, and second of all, papers over this sort of origin of violence in liberalism, which is that it attempts to suture the lag that, generates
Okay,
violence.
the
and so
McGowan
forth.
evidence that's like we couldn't enjoy ice cream or friendship if we didn't die. Why is that relevant to?
It's not if we didn't
Well-
die, it's if we don't understand the death drive as being a primary motivator of human action. The death drive isn't the idea that we're all like obsessed with killing ourselves.
No.
It's that enjoyment in existence comes from the frustration of what we believe we desire. So we
So,
don't actually
is this-
experience
what
desire
I'm
when we
asking-
get
what I'm
the,
asking
for
is,
example, imaginary girlfriend that Sua believes he wants. It's the frustration of that
I'm ex-
desire and the fact that that cycle
What
continues.
I'm saying is that death drive argument about the affirmative team, or is it about the people that we've identified, the suffering
It is
body
about
of
the
black
affirmative team
people?
is a general argument about the way that tropes and the symbolic structures are relationships with each other and with institutions. It's all of these things.
Okay, so given that, why is it relevant to the suffering body as opposed to the one who presents?
Why is the locus of our politics? Oh, we would turn that back on you and
You say
ask,
that that
why
should
is
not
the
be
sort of the
Look,
total point of our
the
politics
significant part about the
relate
death
to
drive
another
is that we
body?
have to recognize that the desire for a perfectly good world as the motivator for our politics is a bad motivator.
case and then the K.
Who's debater?
Smelko.
Smelko, sorry, I didn't go through.
Yeah, your email is bouncing.
Alright, send it to W.A. Smelko at email.com.
Yeah.
Thanks as much.
Give me 1 second.
Yeah.
Since I was Smelko, you said case and
Mm-hmm.
I can flow that.
Is everyone ready?
Hold on 1 second. I totally fucked up and flowed the 1AC and the 2AC.
Classic.
No, I'm ready.
Okay.
If we win any of our framework arguments, they have no answers to the substance of the case. They've conceded that marijuana decarceration is a critical tactic for broader decarcerative movements. Our piece of Murakawa evidence indicates that the prison industrial complex has expanded on the ideology of law and order through individualizing institutional racism. Only the affirmative tactic would be able to resolve that. Now, the Schlag evidence they read here, we resolve this argument. Their Schlag evidence indicates that we need to draw the recognition between the outside and the room and understand that what we do here is limited, which is our argument. Our Welsh evidence impact turns this and indicates that they're the only ones that construct the room by artificially limiting our possibilities. Our argument isn't that the scholarship is entirely disconnected from what happens outside, but rather it is an antagonism that's impossible to unify or neither separate. We can never be fully political and we can never be fully scholars. Instead, we are the middle ground, i.e. recognizing that what we do here has influences because people can appropriate those for whatever ends, but no matter what we do, this scholarship of the debate itself will never actually be political. This also proves that they're the only ones that link to this argument. Now, the Boatyard evidence they read here is not responsive argument, it's not rhetorical communicative strategies mobilizing action, but rather there are political tactics that can be used, i.e. advocating on the basis and decriminalizing marijuana in order to refuse the ideology of incarceration. Additionally, communication isn't totally meaningless in our context, so I'll check it to inherent in the problem of dealing with suffering from contemporary media, neither veteran or cause this condition. What could political action be given the fact that suffering doesn't occur to that's not every stroke can be taken on equal commitment. There's political moral necessity, open discussion, commitment is commitment to the kind of action by seeking to others, recognize and acknowledge speech must make sort of form of action. Bloodshard, political distinction too great to extreme multi action at arm's length, American illusionary position makes it intention, but nothing but an naive illusion creates an empire of suspicion. We must maintain orientation as apathy must take the attempt to be subjects who live in perfect worlds. We must contend with this resurrect compassion to our politics, always particular practical oriented towards doing something about a situation, spectral suffering. We end up with a commitment to involve different citizens, have a role to play, lobbying pressure that will govern to take action, alters commitment causes, lead us out of self-absorption to the world's effective political action, offering a range of involvement with the president as noble and privilege that are being real, leads to compassion, commitment, social change, even such methods do not end all suffering. This argument also contradicts their critique because it proves that their Boatyard evidence says that there's not a linear relationship between communication, i.e. it demands that with every action that somehow leads to a revolution. Argument is that the processes of change are more messy and they require dialogue that can then be appropriated for other people. The chocolate laxative argument is not responsive. Their evidence just indicates that we try and self-regulate moral behavior, which is not our argument. It's not just a legalization. It's not responsive to any of our arguments of decriminalization. My time is up. Let me take yours. The critique. They have no good answer to our Welsh evidence. Their piece of evidence, the alternative argument they read here proves our argument. We are not the ancient fantasy. Our Welsh evidence indicates that the debate is a question of not that we should have. Debate should be a question not of what we individually do here, but of the competing tactics, because that's what can then be appropriated for other people. Their argument about ancient fantasy assumes that we somehow believe that this particular debate is somehow going to cause people to then pursue marijuana reform, which is then going to cause their strategies to work. Rather, that we need to maintain that constant and ongoing process of dialogue within debates over competing tactics that can then be appropriate for particular purposes. That's all of our Welsh evidence. I'll finish that card here. Welsh in 2012.
Yeah, I don't think you have the right part of it, but I can do that for you.
Will you do that?
Yeah,
Okay.
This is also offense. Our inability to meet Harvard's fantasy of a scholar that is on the ground working in activism and explained by our desire to use institutional racism as a strategic tool in debate. This fantasy wastes the strategic utility of dialogue over scholarship and turns into a jockeying over how authentic our resistance is, ultimately resulting in cynicism. Welsh and 12 each aims to unify the competing elements within the scholarly subject position, scholarly reflection, and political agency by reducing the former to the latter. Such attempt are always doomed to frustration because of the impossibility of resolving the antagonism central to the scholarly subject position. Authors imagine an organic, unavoidable, necessary unity. The scholar is wholly public and wholly intellectual, wholly critical and wholly rhetorical, wholly scholar and wholly citizen. The possible unity in which the antagonism vanishes. It's hard to resist the feeling that the bulk of our academic publishing is utterly inconsequential. Gap is not only recognized on the academic side, but appears on the public side as well. The public does not yield to the desire of the social justice scholars. Really, only on the outside of academia, academy, there can be an immediate material political consequences. Broadly, effective action is only possible outside of academia. The failure to unify scholarship politics is predestined. In its symbolic imagination, the rather than unified, effectively campaigning to becoming determined with the antagonism. That means finding ways to keep the competing elements of the antagonism in view. The two elements that constitute the scholarly subject position reflected investigation, the production of unavoidable consequences must be constantly present, each vying for attention. The scholarly subject position becomes unbearable for the gap between lived experience and the wish for embodiment of the scholar is explained not by the basic impossibility, but by the treacherous acts of the colleagues of low moral character. The gap, the existence of academic work that it creates not to serve, is accounted for by the existence of cynical, crafty scholars of low academic rank who just want to get ahead. The experience affective, feel transcendence is produced to a mere empirical obstacle, factless or selfish individuals to be displayed to identify with the symptom. The antagonism between the symbolic practice of scholarly reflection and political action yields academic products that cannot be reduced to disinterested science or political engagement. To be an academic is to be unsettlingly in the political world, but not of the political world. Just to resist the belief that one can finally fulfill the drive to transcend come to terms of antagonism means learning to leave the two impulses constituting the dialectical pair and equal relation to each other. The desire to make a desire and a difference need to be remain in full force. When an individual scholar wants to make a difference to the thing in and of itself versus making a distinct scholarly difference, the antagonism again repressed scholars become an object of disgust. Picaro qualifies the call to political engagement by distancing himself from fellow wanderers whom he characterized want Islam to take the streets as practicing revolutionaries. It also means to be linked to the repression argument. That Welsh card indicates that it's only the demand to unify scholarship and activism as opposed to understanding that they both have mutually influencing effects that causes us to be repressed scholars that does not turn debate into anything productive. I'll also finish the 1EC Welsh card. Welsh and 12, who nevertheless embrace the scholarly split in their identity when scholars concerned with democratic democracy are urged to reduce our concepts suitable for such appropriation within sociological imagination. The sociological imagination is composed of the terminologies of people in their everyday world. Terminology should help citizens to use information to develop reason in order to achieve lucid summations. Most emphasis on supplying concept for use within sociological imagination invites us to recognize that a citizen can access all the indigenously linked details. Some of the citizen is only the shorthand heuristic derived from the theory of the structure begins sociological imagination. Anyway, Mills recommends the direct rigorous pursuit of such heuristic. Now, there's no alternative explanation. Cross-text proves that they have no explanation of what the function of the debate is, or what the function of us should be, or what they are doing. All of their arguments presumes that they have some explanation of how what the relationship between scholarship and activism is, or what activism even means. If they have no explanation, then you should then it's functionally try or die for the affirmative, because we're the only ones with an explanation of how change gets made. Additionally, their death drives arguments are nonsense. Whether in 1999, the purpose is not death seeking, but preservation of self from isolation. As the concept of death seeking is useless and reverse into scientific and justified. The theory flies in the face of evolution makes no sense because love and hate are motivations of the whole organism, not the particles. The death instinct is pure fantasy, a meaningless, absurd abstraction. The death instinct is politically silent. His death instinct theory was determined by his own fear of death. Permutation to do both. Additionally, we are not the repression they're talking about. Our type of logic is created is necessary to create joyous action. Harnett and said, I hope both to add the sense of urgency to Buckner's call and ask the question about what is our mission by advocating engaged communication scholarship that teaches studies and joint political projects committed to building social justice. The hard-carried activist, angry and inflamed, accusing others of transgression while embodying anxiety, achieves little, alienates many, and often succumbs to despair. Working toward a joyful commitment asks us to pledge ourselves to work for social justice and personal growth. Be both radical and remains gentle, demeanor, both outraged by inequality, oppression, joy through commitment to end them. Agape means nothing sentimental, racially affection. I ask my colleagues to consider the field of communication can work for social justice while embodying joyful commitment, hence honoring. Can call to build a political project from a place of overflowing love. Now, their blunt evidence, there's no impact to the Slick argument and no connection as to how it leads to their death drive, how it connects to their death drive argument. You should force the negative to explain that a link between their impact, between the link and their impact argument, or the as instance of their link and their impact argument. Additionally, identification with the law is valuable. Crunch on 88. Although critics criticize law as a function of legitimate existing and racial, particularly legitimate function that has made law receptive, he demands emphasis on deconstruction as a vehicle for liberation, leads to the conclusion engaging legal discourse should be avoided that reinforces the world dating bodies, focus on delegitimating rights. Rhetoric seems to suggest there exists a more productive strategy for change rather than force existing domination. No such strategy has ever been articulated. It's difficult to imagine minorities will ever discover when politics only demand change in ways that reflect the logic of the institution that they are challenged. Demands for change that do not reflect the institutional logic that do not engage in reinforce the dominant ideology. Be ineffective, harmless people call can trigger crisis by challenging an institution by using using its own logic against such rights to courage, powerless people force open a contradiction between the dominant ideology and the reality, rather than using this contradiction to suggest American citizenship with itself illegitimate. Protesters proceeded as if citizenship were real and demanded to exercise the rights entailed by seeking to restructure reality to Black American mythology. Blacks benefit from efforts to resolve the contradiction by granting rights. Additionally, we link turn the pity argument that is made in the Berlant evidence. Our Murakawa evidence indicates it's the individualization of racism that understands that racism that viewed racism as something that's a problem of white animus, and that we needed law Black people against active white supremacists, which justify the expansion of the prison system. Only the affirmative puts into crisis the idea of incarceration, which creates a tactic that can be adopted to do that more broadly and resolve their pity arguments. Anything else?
Okay, so you read a lot of Welsh, or interpret a lot of your Welsh evidence as we actually were the first ones to problematize the relationship between scholarship and political action. And then you read this Harnett card that's like the role of communication scholars. They should have a mission. They should join political projects committed to social justice. We should honor Martin Luther King's call to build our political. This seems to be a very different understanding of the relationship between scholarship and action than what you said earlier.
The piece of that Hartnett evidence, the part about joyous affirmation, says that when people who are scholars have broader visions of what the scholarship could potentially lead to, it's not a form of repression, but it's joyous.
But our argument was never like you literally think that you
projects.
are on the streets being activists right now. It's that you had a fantasy about how it will circulate outward, How does your Welsh evidence resolve that question?
Yeah, our Harnett evidence and our Welsh evidence says that it's not a direct fantasy, but something that motivates us for that very possibility.
How could it be direct? Okay, so you're saying not that you don't have a fantasy, but that your fantasy is accurate.
No.
What? Okay, so
argument is that the fantasy
what is
that
the fantasy
we have
we said you
constructed
had?
does not lead to repression. The idea you think that
what is repression? Like what?
Okay,
just
that was the tag of your card. The fantasy that the 1NC and you just explained is the idea that somehow we will let someone else use our tactic of marijuana reform to achieve change.
That is exactly what you described the function of your advocacy as multiple times in the 2AC.
No, it's not. Our argument isn't that.
Okay, yeah, go.
Our argument isn't that any particular scholar will directly adopt our tactic, but that we need to maintain the process of dialogue, and that ours is one
so
contribution
you're just a weaker
to
version
that.
of the same fantasy, which is like
No,
maybe someone could take us up, but we're not sure.
Even if they don't take our particular tactic, we still think that we should have debates over that tactic, which the 1NC was not a response
Why
to.
should we have debates over that tactic?
Because
that is what can get
those debates is valuable.
Because that is what can
What
avoid
is valuable about them if it's not that people will take your tactics?
Our argument is not that they will have to take our tactic, but that we should have a dialogue about what tactics are beneficial, because they can take whichever one that they want.
Who's the they?
Anyone. The Welsh evidence says that.
So just like a big
it
set of people.
It speaks to anyone participating in the dialogue, viewing the dialogue, or even watching it, and says that creates potential for them to
so now the
appropriate it in their own
difference
ways.
is not that you don't think it'll be taken up. It's that you're not sure that your specific mode will be taken up, but the way you've constructed this dialogical situation provides good skills for people.
Yes,
or tactics.
absolutely. We
Okay,
think
that is
the
what
process
you say the
itself is
function.
valuable.
Sorry, this is what you say the function of
The
your
1AC never said that our particular tactic
Sure.
should be
Okay.
adopted.
So your sort of link out claim is that it's not just us; it's everyone who participates in this activity.
It's that process of dialogue that
It's the
enables.
process. That's
yeah.
good. Great. All right. That's all I wanted.
Okay.
All right.
Prep 3.
convenient language now use it for speech or stuff like that.
Oh, interesting.
It's not really interesting at all.
That's
actually. It's incredibly.
No. I wasn't going to say
It's funny,
it.
we debated Marquise earlier, and he kept describing our arguments as pedestrian. I was like, that's a new one. Pedestrian is a great a great diss. I was like, that's very pedestrian.
Alright, let me know when that one arrives.
I think I'm gonna start using that.
I really hope you don't.
If pedestrian shows up in the one in art, you'll know where it came from. I'm just citing my sources.
You got it, Zach. Here.
Can you resave that? Sorry, just like what happened last time.
Look at the other one. That one. There you go.
Ah, I
Great.
see.
Okay, so it's the case on the Schlag argument, and the rest will be in the one in arm, and then the code. Everyone ready?
Yeah.
Speeds. Great. Two conceded warrants on the Schlag evidence say there's no connection between in-round prescription and out-of-round solvency. The legal system is predisposed to ignoring the kinds of advocacies that the affirmative proffers. The repeated assertion that prescription is politics locks academics inside a circular and failing mode of subjectivity. It's not just a question of like what should we do. The point is that we presume that the intellectual and conceptual tools that we create inside of a space like this one automatically lead to a change outside of the room. There's no reasonable solvency claim given in this round besides reading more cards from a bunch more legal scholars justifying the continued purpose of legal scholarship. This is the cycle that Schlag is talking about. The impact is massive in-round violence because we learn to be mediocre scholars. Schlag and 9, the training for mediocrity does serve social function, good judgment, reasonable stuff, reasonable thinking. Legal academics are playing in the myth of Sisyphus. The main difference is Sisyphus had real rock, the real law, professors rock and hill, or imaginative construction throne making pushes. Symbolic rock is substantially easier to fake and claim success. Symbolic nature makes it transparently more pointless. Why care about this? Scholarship plays an important role in shaping the ways that students think within. And so if they're thought to think in essentially mediocre ways, they'll reproduce those ways of thinking as practice law and politics. If they are repeating the standard move, they will go about wielding power in essentially mediocre ways. And when mediocrity and down with great power yields massive balance. And second is that it's uniquely better to abandon prescriptions and offer good enigmatic descriptions of the system and context. This frees us from a vampiric dependence on the sort of failing structures the judge did not conceive of their roles in imaginary implementation of the apolitic or taking their conceptual tools elsewhere, but instead an ethical reassessment of the self. Schlag in 96, the identification with the ethic of judge and the capacity and produces the false empowerment of the judge believes that the law has certain obvious regulative failure relative to the field of application. Self-identification with the thinker with the judge yields belief that's gratuitable concepts actually map onto the social self-identification precludes any critical appreciation of the categories in relation to the law. The false empowerment leads legal thinkers to while the utopian assessments of the normative consequences they're thought to believe that they're not only studying law but also doing law. It's not to raise the odd belief among legal thinkers and prizing pollutions is somehow a useful way of altering the behaviors legal action unconscious means the judge belief in the effectiveness lead to judicial orders. The legal thinker imitates suggestions by concluding scholarly work where therefore somebody should. Now they are not an answer to Schlag. Their Welsh evidence says that doing social science is good. You're not doing any social science, which means you don't even meet the sort of standard your evidence prescribes. Your arguments a little more than bringing Angela Davis into discussion with Murakami, which is something that many bloggers have already done. It's already written about. It's not even social science. It doesn't count. It doesn't meet sort of basic questions of solvency. It's not even a new theory or conceptual device. If you were to ask the cow what they provide you that could change the way that you engage with sort of marijuana politics, there would be nothing because all of these things are something that we have already engaged in serious discussions about. We've already researched rather heavily, but the point is that they've never asked the question of desire and how we can lead our desire to actually cause us to engage in the kinds of politics that they say are necessary. This is a basic presumption level question. The only answer that they can make is, well, we should do something. Come on, just vote AF. It might work. Our point is that we should fundamentally place a disjuncture in the sort of claim of in the claim we all desire for this for the sort of prescription and description to automatically become useful. We need to refuse that, which will be on the criticism. Now they read a piece of Sawchuk evidence against our Bocher argument. Most of that will be in the one in our, but this evidence says that Boltanski is right and that he's a psychoanalyst, which means that all of their sort of defense on psychoanalysis, I don't know, doesn't make any sense. Okay. The AF has conceded a gentle fantasy thesis where the few should filter their framework and solvency claims through this lens. Debate's commitment to these sort of proposals and description as pragmatism is a fantasy that hides the agential incapacity. Debate is not doing things, it's talking about what we would do if we were someone else. This mediation comforts us by translating balance into collectivity. Their message from the grassroots hides a staunch passivity and investment in the status quo because it lives inside a contradiction between debate as a game and debate as an activity. The fact that they switched from prostitution to weed when they debated us, the fact that they removed their plan text when they debated us, the fact that they're not assuming anything works such that they want to produce
knowledge. All of these demonstrate that the strategy of the strategy of the situation determines the way that their politics and their conceptual tools are produced, which is the sort of fundamental schlag argument that they do not have a response to in the tweaksy. All of this demonstrates that they live inside a world where the good things like the end of the drug war would actually threaten their access to most of the topic. The global warfare provides them new impact tools rather than engage in contingent political struggles. This rhetorical space is condemned to a repetition compulsion that yearns for the world to remain exactly the same, so that the good has to remain good, so that the war on drugs never changes, so the marijuana remains just as sort of inaccessible and illegal as before. This desire for the status quo turns the affirmative means their impacts are all disadvantages to an affirmative ballot. They will snipe at the validity of psychoanalysis, but they haven't answered the sort of fundamental theses that we need to win this debate. First is that we become subjects through our inauguration into language. It alienates us from fulfilling our desire because what we think and say that we want is not exactly what we want. This is a important distinction because the point is that they will make a bunch of prescriptions about what they think they are doing, what they think they want, but our point is that masks a sort of unconscious libidinal desire and investment in certain modes of practice that can only be diagnosed through a rhetorical analysis and not looking into their heads or looking into their psyches, but instead understanding the way that their tropes and rhetoric create certain modes and certain cycles of failure. The Blount card applies this analytic to the relationship between this space and the circulation of narratives about violence, because the presumption is that maintaining the sort of discursive circulation of violence, the idea that people are dying outside of the space, that there are individuals who are dead, is a form of death making because it converts those individuals into rhetorical objects that can then be utilized for competitive success rather than creating the possibility for engaging with those individuals on an ethical level, which means that we are actually a better way of creating the conditions of possibility for their politics, because we have to refuse the notion that the sort of ballot automatically leads to those kinds of politics. The second major thesis is that subjectivity is determined by the death drive. It's not a desire for death, but a repetitious failure to acquire the object of desire. I made this argument in cross-examination that failure and avoidance of the death drive leads to an imaginary failure. We always, with the garb of symbolic legal power represented by fiat, the thesis of causal foreign policy, the idea that every critique app automatically creates some sort of broader change in the macrosphere. This avoids the fact that we all enjoy the fundamental failure, and that creates massive balance. They've conceded the Thamey evidence, which indicates that the impact of this is terminally is extinction, because society that is mobilized around avoiding the death drive and instead moving politics towards the good will automatically create the conditions for worse forms of violence, and the repression the repression of violence creates more possibilities of violence. That's the McGowan evidence, which is a conceded extinction level impact claim. They don't have a response to that. The sort of basic alternative question, the critique neutralizes the ass fantasy and resituates politics in light of the death drive. The no of the ballot solves in two ways. First, it offers a blockage in desire that affords the aff the enjoyment of the death drive, an enjoyment that only emerges through frustration. So that's the Lundberg evidence. The second is that the no acts to shatter the agential fantasy and reorient our investment into contingent politics outside of debate. It forces us to realize that the set of symbolic justifications we typically provide for our affirmatives all skirt the real questions whether we would actually endorse something like a legal marijuana framework and how we would go about doing that, what specific strategies and steps we would do to engage in those politics. Now, sort of basic framework, the role of the bowels to analyze libidinal and investments of the one who sees politics in presentation before considering whether its implementation or conceptual tools are a good idea. If the app produces complacency, which the judge is to be an analyst, we have presented, they have agrees with us and extends that interpretation through the validation and the post-round acts as the sort of moment of the moment of analysis stuff. Their sort of notion that debate is all about just producing conceptual tools forces a certain movement from the master's discourse, the university discourse. We have to produce knowledge, we have to enjoy it, but this misunderstands that we don't actually enjoy being forced into create new conceptual tools. Low 39, the university discourse breeds bureaucracy and rationalize the value of any knowledge economy. Conscious knowledge become the master's knowledge that my workers are pitted against one another. Competition for survival. The modern master takes hold of the university discourse commands not simply to know, but also to enjoy this knowing. The tyranny of knowledge is driven by the demand of the new master to do no more by the agent demands that one to learn some specific content or engagements of activity to be good. What's being demanded is jouissance. You must do this. You must not only get something out of it, you must get off to its use. The subject's desire to non-threatening responsibility to result from academic achievement. The other is doomed to fail and it suffers consequence for their alienation. The more I pursue enjoyment, the more I realize how little I actually enjoy now. They say the Welsh evidence. First, this evidence assumes the Zizek's theory of relationships between subject and ideology, which means you can't win Lacan wrong. The second is that the problem with the Welsh evidence is more of the same fantasy that academic engagement automatically produces effects even when we don't know what they are. We just have to believe Welsh becomes their new master, and their entire argument is that their politics are justified because this one guy elsewhere said that their politics are justified, which demonstrates that they can't even get to the level of justifying their own engagement with politics absent some sort of external other who justifies it in turn, which means that there's no access to the desire argument that leads to the kinds of politics that would be useful in the first place. Now they say that this turns repression, but it destroys your value of life because absent engagement with affect, fantasy, and desire, we lose the very things that give us meaning and cause us to act. Routine 14, the symbolic violence exceeds the ubiquitous found sticking for Lacan identities, the underpinning social or dominatively ideal productivity in different oppositions. Principle morality, master means the merit of life based on pragmatic critique. The model system shows that for what does not let desires get better of its productivity seeks satisfaction. So socially sanctioned ways, level-headed utilitarian subject demand, revolutionary change, unrealistic configuration makes it virtually impossible to entertain the ideals and bulk could be organized differently. Nothing besides social power keeps us invested in the notion that our welfare demands a relentless toil. That psychoanalysis does not tell us how we should desire, but explores the idiosyncratic context of our desire was exasperated people's inability to make their way out of the maze of the masters of morality. Individuals so out of touch with their desire that we're willing to sacrifice this for the sake of social conformity. The point of self-betrayal, such betrayal results in the reassertion of the status quo, portraying these to a kind of psychic death that extinguishes the subject's capacity for a sense of agency, unmarketed agency. They say there's no alternative explanation. Most of that was done above, but now they say they say try or die. This is the most insane way of framing an argument about social justice in relation to a series of other people who are not present in this space. Vote for a cow or all of these people die. That is any form of emotional, intellectual blackmail, which fundamentally sort of skirts the political question, which is another link to the criticism. They say the Weather Hill evidence is about why Freud is wrong about the death drive. That doesn't matter because our point is just about the way that we always fail to access the thing because we desire because of language, which is a different question. This also sets up falsifiability as the standard for analysis. So that means that deliberation is bad. Mutton 8. The falsifiability single most intrinsic addition, getting normative theory and empirical research speaking to another, and deliberative theory for some deliberation simply intrinsically good for some horrendous complex empirical research irrelevant. Deliberative theory fails to sort of meaning social three requirements of productive social theory to clearly define concept specification, logical relation between consistency between hypotheses and evidence accumulated when theories cannot meet these criteria. Their own practical and empirical research attempt to translate deliberative theory to these terms. They discover conceptual ambiguity, which qualifies deliberation tests. Deliberative theory do not develop well-specified explanations for between deliberation and its benefits. 1 second.
So starting at falsifiability.
No, just. There's a bunch of cards, so just Herman, you don't have to read all the cards. Okay.
Okay, so on the Schlag card about mediocrity, what distinguishes the neg scholarship as not mediocre or versus yes?
Well, I guess mediocrity is not like a question of how good the writing is like how good the research is, but instead the way that we think about the writing, research, and performance in relation to a sort of broader public sphere. Our Schlag evidence, I think, makes the claim that when we presume the basic idea of the argument room, that the appearance inside of this space is not necessarily very useful, but it's vaguely useful because something might seep out. That creates a kind of fundamental...
If there is absolutely no use, then why vote negative?
There's not absolutely no use. I think it's important to distinguish that our argument is not like debate bad. It's that the way that you have structured your argument in relation to a specific rhetorical framing is a bad mode of going about doing your politics.
What is the use?
What is the use of debate?
What is the use?
Well, it's weird because you keep demanding that I tell you what the use of debate is. I think you have presented an argument about how debate should function. We have diagnosed what we view as a problem with that and said that we should refuse that because the no to the affirmative is more useful.
There is a use. So what is that use?
Well, I think that there are many possible
uses. So what
uses.
is one possible use? What is your use?
I don't know. One possible use might be we come here and we talk about psychoanalysis. We talk about sort of the way that reality is structured.
Evidence is pretty good on this question. The act of the alternative, the refusal, the no, prompts you to reevaluate your sort of desire toward these things and perhaps have a sort of political subjectivity that is truly your own. So we're helping you.
Okay, so then what do you do once you have that?
What do you do? I don't know, because it's you. That's our point.
What would someone do with a new political subjectivity in relation to
keep asking for a new method?
This is kind of our whole point. The fact that the AF has no justification for what its politics becomes after we tell you it's not anything, and you're just like, well, what do we do then? Our point is like that sort of basic short circuit makes it impossible.
You said that we are wrong about debate, and you have not explained what debate means or what activism means. So what? Okay.
What does activism mean? I mean, activism
exists
and it should continue to happen.
How does the alternative solve the impact of the death drive arguments?
How does the alternative solve?
How does the alternative stop extinction?
The alternative is a way to short circuit the repetition compulsion of the affirmative, which we've located in the idea that it lodges a demand, expects the institution to fulfill that demand, and then begins that cycle in the next debate. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just reads a different affirmative because it's all about strategy anyways. But our point...
I understand how it solves the link argument, but how does it solve the impact? So if you were to say extinction's inevitable because of the death drive, how does the alternative...
You are right that we cannot fiat into existence the idea that everyone in the world changes their relationship with the death drive. We do think that the mode of subjectivity and the relationship to certain rhetorical forms that we've diagnosed is the cause of a sort of broader structural problem, and that voting against the affirmative is a way to begin to alleviate that, in the same way that I guess voting for the affirmative is a way to alleviate structural oppression or something.
All right, so what about the neg scholarship is new or different / not regurgitation, or do you say that's not relevant?
I think we've actually provided a kind of nuanced analysis based on other people's stuff about the way that debate functions in relationship to certain ideas. Thank you for the applause. No,
I'm done with process.
Okay.
Okay. I'm gonna start at the sort of, I don't know. I'm gonna continue on the canon good of the case. That's probably the easiest way of saying that.
One day you will get to this.
No.
Oh no.
He's only got a couple.
I was gonna say there's 5 more opportunities for me to do this. It's looking bad.
flip Megan every time.
Just,
It's just my
just
back
in
is
case.
starting to hurt. I'm just putting you on it.
I'm a heavy guy, you know.
Are you sending out any cards?
No.
The
They're
card-
all either in the 2NC or the 1NC.
Okay.
Can you like?
The card that is in the 1NC is the Simon card.
Damn, you're slow.
Okay. And what?
Yeah, right.
and what card are you
What
starting
do you
on in
mean?
your 2NC doc?
The Lundberg card on falsifiability.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Ready?
Are we just finishing it?
He hasn't started out. That was a different one.
The card was finished. He's gonna read another one.
Oh, okay. That was finished.
Starting on the K, going to the Ks.
Ready?
Yep.
I have more than 3 minutes.
Our rhetorical understanding of psychoanalysis resolves their verifiability questions. Lundberg and 12. The consequence of science response to a number of critics who claim psychoanalysis is unfit theories and inherited practice argue that the prior practice was not falsifiable. Psychoanalysis is science on the basis of its attention to repeatable logical forms of rhetoric office. Psychoanalysis is status as a special kind of science by providing with the techniques for paying attention to mathematical qualities of discourse and observation. They concrete function of the social life of the subject. What is the particular object around the science of oratory, diversity, economy, so trope and enjoyment. What is distinctive about the positive time is not the quantification but the combinatory mathematization. The science of oratory discovers that knowing makes linguistics the most advanced part of the human sciences. Understanding rhetoric is a science-centered subject is taken for granted, maximum replacing attention when it goes on between subjects and symbolic is mechanic premise on the various failures that invite the trope as a compensatory function. They don't have a specific piece of evidence but are a rhetorically inflected reading of Lacan, which I think is important because it is uniquely scientific. Also, is falsifiable. It is bad because it falsifies things like math, social science, history, etc. Perm. Either it's true, both are separate and intrinsic, otherwise they spike out of all links, causing horrific intellectual irresponsibility, or criticizing the only advantage, which means they should defend both the method and the representation, which is an argument that they forefront in the 1AC voting issue. The alternative is to say no to the affirmative. It's a question of rhetoric, so any combination of the two still means you have to vote negative. Any bullshit, which, like mutually exclusive parts, doesn't make any sense because it's all mutually exclusive. The 1AR has to explain what the function, the meaning of the permutation is, for you to consider it later in this debate. Our entire argument is that we should refuse the sort of dialogical call of the 1AC, which means that it fundamentally doesn't make any sense. 2 is all our case arguments are reasons why there's no reason to combine the two politics. I guess I'll talk about that later. You should consider them as suppressing unconscious doubts that underlie their politics. 3 is Schlag and Lundberg are reasons why you should pause and not respond to the continuous demand for affirmation that they're talking about, because that's a sort of affective blackmail that Brad talked about. Now the link arguments. The first is that the overview had a few gems that will extend the two, and there are 2 more here. First is the vampirism argument. The use of victimizing discourse in relation to the prison-industrial complex exploded during the mid-90s with the Clinton regime and the discussion of damaged black family in need of repair. The discourse coincided with the multiplication of nearly 8-fold of the imprisoned African-American population, particularly black men, because the discourse of healing fit within a broader medical carceral complex that views prison as a source of healing for damaged communities. The act simply plays back into this very same discourse. The Berlant evidence describes a rhetorical situation in which we find ourselves as a liberal political sphere of competitive discourse and condensation is not the kind of open-ended academic work and proliferation that their evidence describes, which means that we have a better account of what they are doing than their own Welsh evidence is about part of the liberal notion of competition-oriented advocacy, wherein the tropes of suffering are deployed for the purpose of argumentative conquest. Second is that there are no tools. The affirmative claim to solvency is that academics should be rewarded for creating new tools that filter out the activists. Obviously, there's not a one-to-one relationship between scholarship and activism. However, they say that maybe someone will take it up. There are 2 reasons they're failing here. First is that they haven't created any new tools for activists, which is the argument that Brad made at the top of the 2NC. Second is that their insistence that they receive a reward for this academic production. Their name be tied to the rhetorical tools of uniquely disempowering mode of vanguard academia. Mickey and 13. Environmentalists, why do so many refuse to even acknowledge the role of global environmental agriculture, agribusiness? They are way too much in love with being an activist. Think of the combination of global activism with the ever-evolving social media, or every radical mood is being documented in real time. It's intoxicating. Activists must not be transformed to the upper rung of yet another human hierarchy. Anyway, yeah, we know smoothly those at the top will justify their actions based on a dominant position. We know it's not true to ego of solidarity. We cannot allow ourselves to become more attached to our reputation when ego-driven missions butt up against their ego-driven desire not to change frustration rates. You might think, Stephen, that the strategy of highlighting the connections between racialization and marijuana policy and using that as a critique for a productive rhetorical frame is a productive one for an abolition agenda. But what this gut check AF ballot ignores is that self-reflexive consideration of the obvious linkage between the rhetorical production of academic tools and their immediate acquisition by citizens. Is that space? So you have to resist that urge to vote for it. I don't really know what the alternative does. However, the AF is, I don't know, kind of nice. Maybe the AF politics represents a repeated failed leftist strategy to reinvest power in the expert discourse, which empowers conservatism and opponents' investment in cruelty. McCown at 13. Masturbatory politics appears that the thief enjoyment that knowledge forces reduce the feeling of loss. Joy Michael Moore provides a near perfect illustration of Moore's own present function and avatar joy that derives from challenging the industrial old baseball cap, attached with personal commitment to enjoyment rather than proprietary. Bowling for Columbine managed to wrestle this terrain of employment away from conservatives and Fahrenheit 9/11 marks to turn the other direction. The explicit aim is breaking the identification that exists between the American people and Bush by expressing exposing their president's weakness and questioning its legitimacy. It's very structured, but includes political conversion. The film gratifies leftist viewers. They can align themselves with Moore's voiceovers, chronicles Bush's awkwardness, and they can feel justified in their position. I marked their position. They were the hard-net evidence is the exact opposite of what their Welsh evidence says because it presumes we need to be engaged in joyfully present activist social justice work at all time because Martin Luther King told us to do it. Versus weird that they think they're the future. MLK second, it doesn't seem they don't seem particularly joyful about their social justice, which is our enjoyment argument. Third is that this sort of vacillation, this idea that they don't really know what the hell their advocacy is supposed to do is part of our argument. They say that we shouldn't reject institutional logic. We don't. We have a criticism. We don't even say that we shouldn't criticize the laws. It's a question of the affective relationship we have toward those things, which is a prior question, which is the sort of 2NC argument. This?
Yeah, it's fine.
All right. Case. Baudrillard evidence structuring the uniqueness question. Power does not operate through the repression of speech, but the overall proliferation of that speech. We're constantly barraged by a litany of liberal causes, Typhoon Haiyan, civil war in Syria, Coney 2012, faced with injunctions to act, to get up and do something, pulled in so many directions that we stay in place. They have conceded the fundamental argument. It's not about the relationship between. It's not about the relationship between truth and communication. It's an argument for tools. They have people already have enough rhetorical tools. They have enough ideas. They have enough modes of consciousness that allows them to engage in decarceration. What they need then is what we need is a sort of analysis of desire of why we'd ever do these things in the first place, which is the sort of provided by the alternative. I think they dropped the Zizek evidence. Their only answer in the 2AC is that there's a card about how we engage in moral self-regulation, but they dropped the part that says that legalizing marijuana does not change the coordinates of liberal violence. Their argument relies on the presupposition that decriminalization of marijuana is a radical move that engages in a broader set of dialogues and debates about decarceration. Wrong debate. Marijuana is not the substance of the vanguard. It's the betrayal of the movement. Marijuana is the safe thing. It's opium without opium. It's a medicinal drug. It's the one that middle-class liberal white folks will feel good about taking a stance on because after all, we were all in college once. This also demonstrates our arguments about fundamental structure. They should have said all drugs. They should have said heroin and opium, etc., but they didn't because they're trapped within the sort of resolutional question of whether we should decriminalize only marijuana or not, which is a sort of in-round demonstration of the sort of repetition, compulsion, and the allegiance to structure that fundamentally substructures their politics. Now, legal weed, actually, I'm not going to have time to read that card, so, they don't solve, and they dropped it.
Alright, we have 7:58. There are no cards, but I'm gonna get a drink of water. Oh, my throat's gone. Alright,
We
so
should start calling
it'll
Miles
be the case is first. Case is first. I guess I'm gonna start with like kind of an overview and then the Schlag argument and then do it that way and then the critique. Okay, is everyone ready? The one I see's argument was never that its rhetorical artifact is a conceptual tool that activists can pick up and then end the criminalization of marijuana. Instead, debate should be a culture of argument in which we propose solutions to problems in society and that develops a entire hundreds of people of conceptual resources that is a valuable pool for activists to draw from. If you think that our tactic and the advocacy of the end of marijuana it is an example of effectively participating in that culture, which means that everything in this debate raises the question of framework, which we are winning, and it disproves all of their links. We solve. Our advocacy is good because it raises the normative question of criminality, which none of their evidence takes into account. The concession of our fantasy sans the Zizek evidence means you vote for our advocacy. Now, the Schlag argument doesn't respond to us, and it's a double turn with their claims on the Berlant evidence. They want a linear explanation, a to any of the arguments about the impossible object. They say that we play debate like a game. We said that debate should be a culture of argument about advocating solutions to real problems, which we have done in every single debate, which means there's no inconsistency. And there's obviously false that we invest in the status quo. Our argument is that we should instead create a culture of argument that is designed precisely to change it. Our Welsh evidence indicates that this accusal of a scholar of their low moral character, that they have an investment in the status quo, is in fact a cynicism that depoliticizes any possibility of the academy and locks us in the argument room because we're more concerned poking fingers at one another than ever talking about structures of domination. This is how the permutation functions. We analyze them. Our Welsh evidence indicates how their investment in this cynicism comes about through their getting off on telling us that we don't work. If their vision of enjoyment is telling black people that their political strategies aren't good enough, then fuck that enjoyment. That's terrible. The argument that we use black people as rhetorical successes is not true. We are are informed by and authorized by the scholarship of black women that are involved in these strategies, and say that the debate community should use their scholarship in a culture of argument to inform the way that we come to advocacies. That's necessary because their disavowal of black scholarship proves that we lead to things that do nothing to ever question or challenge injustice, only question ourselves, which is the trapping in the argument room that they criticize. Now, the death drive is ridiculous. You don't solve extinction. It would never spill over. The alternative is causing us to question ourselves doesn't ever resolve it, and we solve the impossible object. The critical point of our affirmative is that we have already reevaluated our desire. Our Welsh evidence asks the question of the limit of our politics and then locates us within an imperfect situation and demands the necessity of such a culture of argument in spite of that limits. Now, the moment in the 2NC when Bowman says that we shatter the fantasy of the linkage between communication and action and instead move us to what specific steps would we actually take, proves that there are nothing but fancy language describing the demand for a linear relationship of activism that is obvious bullshit in both teams' opinions. Now, the argument that we rely on other scholars in Welsh is just to claim that we read cards. The desire to locate everything in us is bad. We should rely on and be informed by the scholarship of others like black people who have different perspectives. Now, the Rudy evidence, we engage affect and desire. Obviously, that was the above. They say triadize emotional blackmail. We're just saying it is better to embrace our imperfect interpretation that if you have no better option, even if the language was problematic, that's not enough of an impact to overcome the value of the affirmative technique. Now, the card that we read does not say that falsifiability is good, which means that the rest of their stuff here doesn't apply. It says that we are not, the argument that we're going for is that we are not a repression because we do not we do not desire the impossible object of perfect communication and political action. We locate its imperfection. The permutation was explained above. It resolves the link arguments about the death drive, etc., because our analysis of them is just as good as their analysis of us. They say discourse of failing causes the prison. We say the prison is the reason why that quote-unquote black failure is happening and demand decarceration. They say we ask for the ballot, someone wins, which means we both want it, and we also do not individualize. We are the only ones that say there should be a culture of argument. Their individualization by saying you want to be the one that does it is the only individualization in the round.
be the case in the case. Everyone ready?
Wait a second.
Okay. Couple easy ways to vote negative in this debate. First, you have failed to create the good version of the culture that you say that you are performing and inaugurating, because other performances outside of this round have demonstrated that you're not actually committed to a certain kind of culture, but just the form of the culture itself, i.e. the destruction of the prison industrial complex doesn't really matter, because it's just a question of the sort of strategic inauguration of a culture of individuals who strategically compete to utilize various tropes as sort of rhetorical justifications for, I don't know, destroying the prison industrial complex, destroying the prostitution complex, etc., etc. All of these become part of the form of the system rather than the content of the system, which is our sort of, which is the form content distinction that will be explained better on DK. But the second is you haven't actually produced any new tools. When we said, what new tools do you create? You said, well, we're just producing a culture that could produce new tools. Our point is that this is an endlessly self-justifying cycle because we just need the culture that will then produce the tools. But we can't give you the tools because we don't have the culture yet. And you get out, you get the point. Our point is that you can vote negative on presumption because they have not won a sort of base level solvency question, which is why does the affirmative do anything to accomplish the creation of the culture that they say they are engaging in? They have repeatedly run the same affirmative against us in numerous different times. They have won on this argument. They have gotten at least a ballot, Stevens ballot on this argument before. So the question should be, why is this an actually productive mode to engage in repetitively? What does the sort of inauguration and the repetition and recognition of that cycle create? Our point is that it creates nothing. They have no evidence that it does it. You should not endorse that culture because it sort of commits us to the circular repetition of the performance rather than the liberation of desire for engagement in politics. This will be clear on the K, but they say that their sort of analysis creates libidinal energy. There's no justification for this argument. It also presumes that deliberative democracy is a good way of engaging in these kinds of politics. They've conceded that it doesn't on the K, but that'll be later. Now, we're not going to go for the Baudrillard argument, but I think the Zizek argument's very good. It says that marijuana is the liberal palliative. It allows us to feel radical by advocating for something that we all have a little bit of personal investment in and engagement with, but it doesn't. But it allows us to avoid it allows us to avoid any sort of real changes. I think that they're right that they do call into question sort of the prison industrial complex, but our point is that marijuana is a reformist reform, not a non-reformist reform, which means that they link in the same kind of bad policies they talk about. They could have done something like call for the end of the entire war on drugs, but they didn't do that because they were too stuck within the symbolic system of debate to sort of liberate their desires from that and create a real political advocacy, which conceded sort of a conceded analysis there. Now the critique they've conceded, the sort of role of the judge. I know this is technical, but there's no alternative offer in this debate that we've determined how the structure of the debate should function. They offer a case. Simply agree disagree with our interpretation. The sort of the feedback moment after the debate provides a moment to understand how those interpretations were or were not good. This isn't unfair because it simply requires the defense of the method and context of the affirmative key to sort of fair K-AF debates, because we have to have the ability to criticize the way that they have created a sort of non-falsifiable injunction. And we have a better understanding and explanation of how this rhetorical situation itself actually works. And they have a bunch of cards from Welsh who indicate that, like, yes, in the abstract, rhetorical scholars might be doing good things when they create new possibilities. But our point is that in the specific context of the debate, we are stuck in a cycle. We propose some sort of broad change. We propose the creation of new tools. We don't create those tools. We then ask for the recognition of the proposal of the creation of those tools, and then we begin that process again. It creates repetition compulsion, which means that we become addicted to the status quo. We don't want the status quo to change because our good arguments are fundamentally tied to no change in the status quo. This is a sort of, I think this is an unanswered argument in the one error, which means you should not do a lot of extra analysis here. He says the death drive doesn't lead to extinction. Our point is not that we fiat everyone changing their minds, but that we have identified a culture that is committed to an ideal of the good at the expense of thinking about the constituent failures in communication. Avoiding the thought of those failures leads to the sort of the same type of politics, which our Fahmy evidence indicates leads to total destruction, because we become obsessed with the implementation and institutionalization of the good in our morality, which sort of ignores the fact that our politics are constantly constitutionally failing, which is sort of serial or I don't know, debate serial policy failure argument that they haven't answered. Now the Lundberg evidence is very good about how we should interrupt this cycle. It says we should say no to the affirmative. That creates an injunction and a temporary stay in the movement of these rhetorical situations. It's not just a question of like Cal MS getting the no. It's the point that we need to insert an injunction into the system and then say no to creates a blockage of affect that requires that we might need to take our politics elsewhere. They say that this is liberal, but the whole point is that their politics assumes a fundamentally liberal notion too, because it also thinks that we should do things on the street, that we should protest against politics. The only difference is that they don't have a way to actualize those politics. Our point is that saying no actually makes it more likely that the affirmative
entirety of the case better than the AF argument that was not responded to in the 1 year. They've also conceded the floating pick, which is the Mickey C evidence, which says that you should sever their conceptual tools from their specific name because that leads to a narcissistic investment with our own success. I don't think this links to the alternative because our point is simply, our role in this debate is simply to point out the ways in which their sort of analysis has failed. It's also too late for 2 AR responses. You should hold them to the text of the 1 AR because we made all of sort of block and 2 in our analysis based on those sorts of strategic concessions. Now he's conceded that psychoanalysis is a science, a very good piece of Lundberg evidence indicates that it's a sort of analysis of repeated situations of trope. I shouldn't have to re-explain that because his only response was that the death drive isn't real. They have also conceded a deliberative theory is not falsifiable. They set a falsifiability standard in the 2AC by saying the death drive is wrong because it's not falsifiable. We read a piece of Mutt's evidence that indicates that deliberative democracy does not create the conditions for politics. It's a fundamentally non-falsifiable theory that's based on the hope that deliberation does something, not the actual evidence, which is a sort of basic but presumption level argument. We don't have to win any other argument inside of this debate to simply win that they have a bad model of politics and actualizing the politics that they talk about, and the permutation doesn't make any sense, mostly because of these link arguments. We are saying no to the affirmative, so the permutation is fundamental non-starter because we've won the framework of how you analyze the affirmative in relation to our argument. But 3 sort of final conceded link arguments. First is that the strategy determines the commitment. I explained most of this above, but the sort of shifts in the way that they engage with these politics demonstrates they're committed to the form rather than the content. Our point is that is the only way to engage with the politics. They say the permutation is a way to analyze the negative. Our point, they conceded they're sort of flipping the dialectics argument that simply ignores and removes the possibility that they have to consider their own investment in certain fantasies, and they just get to say, well, you're invested in fantasies too. Our point is that we have diagnosed a specific failure in your politics, and saying no to those kinds of politics creates the possibility for change, but saying no to the negative doesn't really mean anything because it's just a question of whether or not the interpretation itself was accurate. That just sustains the academic fantasy that we can just avoid any sort of confrontation with our fantasies. Our point is that we should not ignore that. Now there will be a lot of emotional blackmail, but they've conceded a link turn argument, which says the Berlant evidence says that we always recycle the tropes of, for example, the black woman, the dying prisoner, in order to continuously justify our politics, which doesn't do anything at the end of the day.
Alright, how much we in? For something?
352.
352.
Really just miserable.
I'm sure he's wandering around outside.
Yeah, just cracking jokes, chatting about something.
I didn't even realize that today is Easter. Someone just texted me Happy Easter.
You celebrate Easter?
I have some family members that celebrate Easter, but I don't personally.
My fault.
I guess my family's probably doing an egg hunt. They always do that.
Your family is so white.
Sorry, can you give the order real quick?
Case and then decay.
I think I forgot to do that for the whole 1AR. It's just nonsense.
Is everyone good? Okay.
Everything the Tunar says is a glorified framework argument. If we win our framework argument that the debate is a dialogical process and it should be about competing tactics and policies, and you vote affirmative solely on the basis that marijuana legalization, decriminalization is a good tactic for ending the prison industrial complex more broadly, I'll answer the Zizek argument here because that's the only thing they could win if we win our Welsh evidence. Our Murakawa evidence, our Sudbury evidence are better than their Zizek evidence, which just indicates that we revolve the regulation on marijuana because it's something that isn't actually that liberal. Our Murakawa evidence indicates that it's not about marijuana or particular drug laws, but tying that to the broader critique of incarceration, which is why our tactic and policy and what and advocating for decarceration has potentially politically valuable benefits if it were adopted. Now, the affirmative was never that you should vote affirmative because our policy would cause, our advocacy would cause other people to literally appropriate our tactic, but rather the affirmative, it participates in a process of dialogue that enables people to vote to appropriate the outcomes that happen as a result of it, which means the majority of his link arguments on how we're trying to inaugurate that process do not make any sense. Our framework for the debate is that debate is a process of competing policies and tactics because and should not be a question of individuals. They have conceded our Welsh evidence that there is an antagonism between scholarship and activism, which is recognition of the limits of that, i.e. scholarship can never fully be activist. We can never do anything in this debate that actually changes things materially on the ground. However, that doesn't mean that they can never be unified at all. Rather, it means that they have effects that are more complicated that our Welsh evidence indicates that despite that, just the process of dialogue enables people to appropriate things for their own ends. This is not about any individual person breathing new or innovative arguments, but rather when people test their argument versus each other or come to conclusions in the process of deliberation. So all of his arguments about how we individually don't add anything new does not make any sense. That you should prefer our interpretation or our framework argument because they've conceded the cynicism argument. No good answer. Our Welsh evidence indicates that they are invested in a politics of cynicism that always poses to scholars. Why aren't you good enough? Why isn't your resistance on the ground or more active? This will be explained more on the critique, but it proves that they link to all of their arguments and only we actually analyze them. It also avoids the majority of their link arguments too. That also avoids the link arguments. Now, they say that we do not create or inaugurate this. Our argument was not that we inaugurate this part of we inaugurate this mode of discussion. Rather, this mode of discussion exists every time people debate about different policies and different tactics and advocacies, and they should lose because they did not participate in that, which means that if we don't meet our framework argument, then there's no basis for you to vote negative, and you vote solely on the fact that our policy, that we've advocated for good. They say we don't produce new scholarship. Our argument wasn't that it's good because each individual produces a new scholarship that can then be advocated. This links to our argument about individualization versus collectivization. It's not about what we individually do that's new, but that the fact of exchanging arguments and testing them versus each other allows new clashes and new comparisons that could then be appropriated for their own purpose. They're the only ones that individualize this. The Zizek argument was introduced above. Their evidence is not as good as they're selling it. Their card just indicates that marijuana, just indicates that marijuana reform as a way of self-regulation on its own is not potential. Our Sudbury evidence assumes the connection between that and the broader critique of decarceration, which is what the affirmative is advocating for. Now the critique, I'm going to start with the floating pick argument. I'm just going to start by dealing with the floating picks argument. It wasn't in the 2NC. It wasn't clear enough in the 2NC, which means that it justifies new affirmative answers. Additionally, floating picks are illegitimate because they skew the ability of the affirmative to generate any offense. Additionally, we still have offense versus floating pick because they... my timer stopped running. because they disagree with our framework argument and our Welsh evidence, so you can view all of that as offense. They also link to their argument about how they claim credit for that moment in cross constituency when Bowman was like, oh, I think I have some nuances to my argument, proves that they link to this too, because voting negative will just be an affirmation of them thinking that they have some nuances, and that's why they are able to incorporate our affirmative, so they link to any reason that they get the floating pick. Anyway, now, back up to the permutation, if the alternative, if it's all that's needed to solve is the alternatives process of analyzing, and that's sufficient to do that, then only the permutation would resolve that. The permutation would be that understanding in our Welsh evidence that scholarship cannot actually be directly activist, but it can inform activism through a more dialogical process. They have conceded that we are an analysis of the 1NC and of the negative. Bowman massively biffed this because all he says is that it forces us to, or all he says is that
we run from our fantasy.
All he
They
says
run
is
from theirs.
all Bowman says is that they run from our. All Bowman says is that we run from our fantasy. This proves our argument because they are running from their fantasy. They are invested in the process of cynicism. All of his arguments about how we constantly read marijuana as proves our argument because they're the ones that consistently invest in the cynicism and every single debate about why academia could never have any potential. Our Welsh evidence says that cynicism, that's saying that scholars have to be more activists, have to be more, is what leads to the scholarship being totally mediocre and meaningless. They make this roll of the ballot argument. The entire debate is about this roll of the ballot, whether or not the affirmative, or whether or not the debate is about competing tactics. Additionally, even within the roll of the ballot argument, they have even within their roll of the ballot argument, all of our analysis about why the permutation would be an analyzing of them too would result in this argument. They say that debate is cyclical and we don't create anything new, and that is strategic because we just read prostitution as too. This argument does not make sense because our argument is not that our individual contribution is valuable. What about the slot card?
They trap us in the
The
argument
impact of
room.
the cynicism evidence is that the impact of cynicism is that they trap us in the argument room, because if we are consistently focused on what other scholars and activists are doing, then we can never connect and create conceptual tools that can then be appropriated. The falsifiability argument, the piece of Welsh evidence uses Zizek, which was their argument, which means that we would concede their Lundberg evidence, which indicates that falsifiability when connected, or that Lacan when connected to rhetoric, makes sense. There's also no impact explained to why we're reliant on that model of democratic deliberation, or why falsifiability is necessary. The alternative injunction arguments are all solved by the permutation because they find the link to our Welsh arguments true. We are in injunction against them as much as they are against us. Good day. Good day.
Good day.
Why did you put it
This girl that goes to UC Berkeley, not in Berkeley.
I like how it matches your tie.
Thank you. No, I forgot to wear my pink socks.
3-0 for the negative from Harvard. Sarah wants to start.
I can. So I think I basically voted on presumption because I don't think you have a defense of the process of deliberation as being valuable for generating anything. And I think specifically this like Mutz evidence from the 2NC like falsifiability debate gets kind of blown off and just makes it really tough. Your only real response in the 2AR is like they haven't explained why we rely on deliberation. Like the entire way you're explaining your framework debate is about deliberation. Like you use the exact phrase like, you know, the process of dialogue is good because it means people can test arguments via deliberation. And I think if we've established a standard of empiricism or falsifiability, that there is no evidence that deliberation is valuable for that. And I think it also sort of disconnects from the evidence you're actually extending. Like your Welsh evidence isn't really about a process of deliberation or dialogue. It's just about scholars generating tools that are valuable, and I don't think you have an internal link for why deliberation is important to make those tools better or to generate those tools. And I think that sort of blends in with the sort of Lundberg evidence about as well in terms of when you sort of concede the frame of you're both kind of saying Lacanian desire, etc., influences things, that I think that their evidence is a little bit better in terms of your sort of model of making demands upon the law, etc., makes your political subjectivity dependent on the other. I think that makes sense in the context of deliberation too, that your ability to generate political ideas is dependent on these others that are deliberating with you or whatever. You know, I think I sort of thought a little bit about your argument that they're invested in cynicism, but I'm not totally sure either that you've really established a link to that or that in this case it really functions very productively for you if they're largely just going for presumption anyway. At best, I think it potentially disproves their alt-solvency claims about the interruption leading to different political actions, but even if you disproved that, I still think I would just vote neg on presumption because you don't really have a defense of your method as being productive. But I'm also not totally sure, like, despite whatever I think about them, why you've won that their strategy in this debate is one that is actually invested in cynicism. And while they are certainly cynical about your mode of politics, they're certainly making a variety of arguments about why interrupting that mode can lead to new political possibilities that are not trapped within desire. And so I don't really think that you've done enough link work to establish that they're truly so cynical that they've annihilated any potential. So I think like weirdly it would have been better for you given I think your observations about like I don't know if the Zizek on like chocolate laxative is that great to make the debate more about in framework terms why your particular tool or strategy is good rather than reframing everything around it's just about the process, because I think that's the place you actually have the least defense of. I do think that from your perspective I would push a little bit more too on some of the you make the argument that you're like they haven't actually created new tools, to which their response is, well, we haven't created a new tool, but the process of debate or deliberation leads to new tools. And I think going one further to kind of be like, there's no ev that debate in this sense, especially not like competitive policy debate, is really producing the academic tools that like Welsh, etc., is talking about in that sense. Like there's not that much sort of like original innovative scholarship that is this form is necessary for creating. So I think given that the debate is shifting to be about process, not their tool, making those interruption arguments in terms of process and not tool would have helped a little bit, but either way.
I'll go. I agree with most of what Steven said. I just wanted to add a couple of things for me that were important. The first thing was just like framing. I thought the Haft's role, the ballot framing, was a little weird given that at least my understanding of the way that the 2NR links developed was like it's, you know, tactics are basically his way of saying form versus content, and like you engage in, like he uses debate as a link, and I think the fact that you're like you should focus on tactics as the role of the ballot is a little bit weird given that I think the line the 2NR is like strategies determine commitment, and they have this link argument that you guys have blown off, and like I don't think it's great, but I don't think you ever really answered that like it's weird to say that the role of the ballot is comparing tactics when they're saying you should just compare your individual, you know, fantasies, and they're like making arguments about desire, and then you're just talking about how I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this. Basically, I think that their explanation of their link impact turns your role of the ballot, so I thought it was weird to me that that was how you started the 2AR. So, for example, if your role of the ballot is just a process of dialogue that's good because other people can appropriate the incomes, and it's not a question of individual inputs into that process, their whole point is that that's bad. And I don't really understand why you would start the 2AR or just like the framing of that way unless you're just going to beat them on that anyway. And like Steven already kind of alluded to, I thought the weakest parts of the AF debating on this were a defense of that deliberative process. And sort of like another, so I think that the 2AR describes this exchange, like that you create the deliberative exchanges allowing new arguments which other people can appropriate, so it's irrelevant what we put in. But I think that's kind of confusing to me, given one, you've conceded that you don't actually input any new scholarship, you're using someone else's, so I don't really know how that deals with their argument that you're literally just regurgitating, which feeds into that like self-sustaining cycle argument, which I think is one of their best impacts. And the second thing is I think that the 2NR's links all on this page are mostly about that endless self-justifying cycle. So if we let structures dictate content, then I don't really think that this roll of ballot gets you anywhere except linking to their K. Does that make sense? And I think that even though I agree completely with the AF that like your Zizek card does not really deal with the specificity of their cards that are like, we can use marijuana as like part of this a particular reformist demand for marijuana in the context of the broader critique of the prison industrial complex, and that's good. I think that card is really good. I don't remember what the site is, but I do think that they deploy this in the debate by linking it to the debate structures argument that I was talking about before. So like they say the fact that you don't call for like a broader end to the war on drugs rather than marijuana, and I mean they don't actually say this, but like your underlined part of your card, it says marijuana or heroin or that isn't great when you're reading it. But so that just proves that you're stuck in these structures of debate, you're letting that dictate the content, which sort of supports their argument about how these deliberations don't actually result in change, and even if your argument is they don't have to, it seems like it's just selfless sort of intellectual masturbation without resulting in any people ever having the opportunity to appropriate the tools. That was the first thing. The second thing is, so the thing I was the closest to voting on was, I think, for the AF was the cynicism dissat. For me, like Steven said, I think the link needs to be much more well developed. I also just was very confused about the description of the impact. So I thought it was smart to use Schlag as the impact, but the way that you explained it when you were extending it in the 2AR was then we're stuck in the argument room, and like isn't your whole point that that's good because we should be deliberating in the argument room and it doesn't matter what happens outside? So I was sitting here and I was like, okay, so we're stuck in the argument room, but like isn't that good or is that bad because the arguments we're making are bad because they're pessimistic, and I didn't really know what the terminal impact to it was. I think if you'd explain the link a little bit more and explain like go through just like some of the quotes from the 2NR, like it's pretty clear he's very clearly waffling the line between wanting to defend an alt that does something versus just saying we should do nothing, and I think you could use some choice quotes here to like sort of bolster your link. But regardless of the link, you need to do some if you assess before this 2AR that like the way you're going to beat them is like your roll of the ballot is slightly better, and like if that's a wash, you can still beat them on an impact turn under their framework, which is what the cynicism DA is in my opinion. You need to spend more time on how that impact interacts with their, from what I could basically say, like conceded extinction impact to this death drive stuff. Like I don't really think you guys ever at any point are like, because you kick all of the like it's non-falsifiable stuff. And so like it's just sort of floating around out there. I mean, it's not really that important to the decision ultimately, but it's there. And so you need to say, this interacts with their impact because, well, I mean, first of all, it probably turns the internal link to it, right? Because the desire would be more repression. But I just think you need to do more impact work on that for me to vote on it, because I agree that your defense of the process is bad. I also don't think you should concede that deliberation is non-falsifiable. Like the 2AR, literally the only answer to this is like this doesn't assume our form of deliberation. I have no idea what that means. I know you were like running out of time, but I would have started earlier on when you're discussing the role of the ballot. Like I thought you guys were really good about being consistent in the 1AR and the 2AR by explaining this is what our AF does. It's distinct from their like assumption that we're trying to cause outside the debate change. The problem is like that doesn't really grapple with the way the link morphs once they realize that's not what your AF is saying. I don't know, maybe they knew that earlier, but they didn't describe it this way, is that you need to be like, okay, well, their links all assume that we do want to do this outside the debate. If they don't, their links about debate structure don't make sense because the very process of debating this is good, but you need to like tie that to some impact in your AF, because like even if I thought you want a lot of your deliberation impacts, I have no idea what they're tied to. The only just in general, I mean, I guess you won't be debating them on this side again, but teams like this, sorry, but like teams like this, like the AF tends to get lost, and like besides the first 15 seconds of the 2AR, I could, if I didn't remember, like if I had memory loss from the 1AC, I don't remember what the impact of the AF is, and I think that letting the debate end up like that is usually never good for the AF because you're only talking on their terms. And I think this AF is set up to beat, or at least my perception of it is that it's supposed to be set up to directly clash with Ks that say, no, it's bad to deliberate about this stuff. We should just say, fuck it. And so that needs to be a bigger part of the 2AR and less of the like getting bogged down in the line by line about like like, just blow off this Zizek card. Like, this card is generic. I have no idea what it's talking about, but it certainly isn't as good or specific as our two solvency pieces of evidence that said that it's key to be tied to a broader call. And then, like, spend more time on this impact calc, spend more time on engaging in this. The last thing I'll say, just like 2 quick things, and I'll let Teddy talk, is the first is I don't really know what the perm gets you if they win all these link arguments. Like, it sounds like even if you, I don't know what the taglines "we solve the process of analyzing two" means if it's still in the context of a bad form of analysis.
Yeah.
So either like cut the perm or explain why it solves something that the plan wouldn't achieve on its own if you win all of these arguments. Otherwise, I think it's just a waste of time. For you all, like, I just don't think just saying we read a card and it's a floating pick is enough for me. Like, I read that card and I don't understand. Maybe I just, like, I'm not smart enough, but I don't understand what that card gets you. So, yeah.
Can I quickly ask, is it okay if I ask her a question about the argument room thing? So, like, if we had explained that, like, being in the argument room is good if the argument room is a space to discuss, like, the structure
They make the
of
argument
domination,
room
etc.,
useless.
but
Yeah.
they make the argument room just, like,
Yeah, that's
from
the
your
link to
point
the
of view.
cynicism
Yeah.
DA that was
Yeah.
just missing for me.
Okay.
Just like it's okay to be in the room if the room is productive, and if the room is not productive and it's just blanket rejection, that's bad.
Yeah.
Okay.
As a humble bus driver, I only have sort of 4 reflections that I kind of wrote down, and some of them have already been mentioned. The first one is the kind of plain specific link argument. I agree with both the reading of the evidence and the way that you positioned it, which is there is sort of begs the question about why not a more radical call for the war on drugs. And I think perhaps maybe you can say that that's one of the tools that we offer the audience that's witnessing is to make further connections about other kinds of policies that might be a way to kind of situate the solvency mechanism. The we've already talked about that. The second is also what we've already talked about, which is kind of the equivocation about the mechanism model of the app. You have kind of 3 different ways that you've described your process. The first is kind of a culture of deliberation. The second is what happens in the 1AR, which is like you explode all of these affective forms of deliberation, and the third is dialogue. I think here you can do one of 2 different things. The first is either kind of just by the beginning of the 1AC support a social justice framework. It seems like that's what the app is. And then don't cower before the questions of the 1AC just because they're kind of bullying you with, well, what does it do? You can say, you can give concrete examples because that's probably what produced the app in the first place, and also what kind of Angela Davis and others would draw from. Or the second, which is to kind of deepen the understanding about the process of dialogue, because in some ways that's what the dialogic dialectic is. We can advance a surety in our advocacy, but also include with it a counterpoint, which is a necessary reflexivity. And so then it makes what you've done not sound like what their link arguments are, which is just like constant circulation and exchange, constant investment and failure, but instead kind of a repositioning in kind of an Adorno sense of something that says yes and no at the same time, and that also might help the permutation make a little bit more sense. The third kind of reflection or categories that I have is, I thought the 1AR was on point in this debate. I thought it was one of the best speeches that I heard. But I thought by the 2AR you needed to resuscitate your race-based criticism because that's the place where the affirmative gains the most an advantage that the negative can't capture, and also provides another impact to the cynicism argument. It encourages us to reread psychoanalysis from all of the position that you want, which is that it's a view from nowhere. It's one that doesn't attend to the politics of the debate community that's present. It doesn't allow us to think about what transformations have taken place both within you but then also within all of us. And then that kind of, that would I think might flip my entire read of all of their link claims and make me much more skeptical of it. The last kind of set of reflections is kind of rethink about the way that you've thought about the alternative. And one way I think that you're just like, oh, we do it too, because you think it's just kind of a basic transference. Well, if they want to talk about affect, we talk about affect. But they have a much more sophisticated understanding about what the no or the injunction is. So instead, I think that you should move a little bit further to defend what a process of affirmation might be in psychoanalysis. And that might be something like, well, I mean, it is quite vulnerable to try to advance something that says we ought to do something when we are surrounded by a constant culture of criticism. That does take a lot of strength and power, and I think that might be something that could be of value and also explain what political transformation might be in the kind of new leftist argument culture that is that is a part of debate. So, but in the end, I sort of agree with the kind of negatives alternative, that the kind of pause to reflect on what we might have in terms of our investments, and also why the kind of culture of argument might produce its own perverse enjoyment, seems to me to be a good impact claim that I can feel comfortable voting negative on. So again, this is an excellent debate with exquisite arguers, and so these are just like, you know, really small things to kind of take away, except for the
Can you
it's sort of like, instead of thinking, I mean, Adorno's like kind of really pessimistic and not a cynical way. I mean, cynicism says there's absolutely no productivity that takes place when we have an argument and an exchange, and Adorno might agree with that. But what we might want to include is both a yes and no at the same time. So it's like, I want to say that right now, I feel very sure that we could connect marijuana laws with the position of decarceration. But at the same time, it might be totally wrong. Right? And I'm not really quite sure if that investment is correct. But unless you offer that yes, there's no way of exposing a no. And so that's a way of thinking about a permutation that's not just, oh, we read you too, but instead we're actually doing something new and different, but also we're not sure that it's right. But that kind of can collect an audience to also reflect on how they might interact with it, and also how they might critique it at the same time. And that explains what you're doing in this space differently than just, oh, we've offered some scholarship, but we're not going to stand by it because
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, y'all.
Well,
Thanks,
thank you.
everybody.
Congratulations.